I think to understand why the foundation came about, it would be good to know a little background of our community, because it was a struggle within our community that led up to the establishment of the foundation. But in order to do that, I wanted to go back in history. We call this presentation Justice in Our Time, because at the time that we started the campaign for redress, the majority of people who were affected were still living. And so we wanted to ensure that they would see justice done in their time. And I'm proud to say that by time, I would say that about 75 to 80% of the people were living at the time of the agreement. So in essence, Justice in Our Time was the appropriate title. But to give you a little background, the first Japanese came to Canada very early, 1877. And if you look back, that's quite a long time. It's over 140 years in that sense. And it's interesting because most of the Japanese who came to Canada came during this period between 1903 and 1908. In fact, my grandparents came in 1892. I had one grandfather come in 1892 with his wife, and my other grandparents came from Japan in 1903. And they both settled in Prince Rupert in British Columbia to work on the on the fishing industry, work within the fishing industry. My mother was born in Prince Rupert area. But it's interesting because the majority of the immigrants who came at that time were really males, young men who came to make a fortune. In essence, if you're in the Japanese culture, if you're not the oldest son, the chances of inheriting things, property, so on, was rare. And so if you were down the scale in the order of birth, then the possibility would be that you may not end up with that much. And so many of those people are the ones who ventured out and said, I'm going to get rich, come back, buy my things, like the property, whatever. Unfortunately, that never ever happened. The majority of people who came stayed because they just couldn't make enough to be able to do that. And so what happened is that we brought in picture brides for the males because they were going to stay. And so they would send their photos to Japan. The families would look at it and say, oh, that looks like a suitable suitor for you. Send the daughter or whoever to Canada, and they would get married. There are some horror stories because some people sent pictures of some handsome person, sent it, and then they arrive. The woman arrives and is greeted by this person she doesn't even recognize. And so then there were quick divorces too. Before they even started, there were a lot of separations in the beginning. It's interesting how that worked out. There were very few families who came, and it's interesting because in my family, both my grandmother and father came at the same time together, which was very rare. And I'm still trying to figure out why that happened. The one thing about the Japanese in British Columbia is that they didn't have the right to vote. And as a result of the fact that they couldn't vote, they could not enter the professions. That applied to anyone who came here or who was even born in Canada. You did not have the right to vote. If you're of Japanese, Chinese, or Indian background, or indigenous background as well. And there's this fellow, Tamaki Tahoma, in 1908 challenged the law. Interesting story about that legal battle is that he actually won in the provincial courts. He won, and then it was appealed. He won in the federal courts, it was appealed. The federal government sent it to the Privy Council in England, and in England, it was overturned. And so he did not get the right to vote. And it was only in 1949 that the provincial government of BC passed legislation that Japanese could vote. His son was there in the gallery. He was invited, but by that time, Tamaki Tahoma was no longer with us. Everything wasn't that smooth in the early days. There was influx of Chinese, influx of Japanese, Indian background people. And as a result, there were groups within Vancouver who were against anti-Asians. They wanted an all-white society. And as a result, they marched upon a group of about 500 demonstrators, marched upon Chinatown and to Japan area of Vancouver, and they ransacked the businesses, and a signal, a reminder that they were not welcome here. And so in a sense, that was likely the first Asian anti-racism riot in Vancouver. As a result of that, things changed because the government legislation tightened up. By that time, they had already imposed the Chinese head tax as a way of trying to keep out Chinese immigrants. By that time, they had enacted, or they shortly enacted a law to prevent Indian people coming from India and Pakistan, because they did a Continuous Passage Act. They passed the government, and they passed it knowing that, and the act said that in order to be able to land in Canada, you had to come directly from that country. But they knew that no ship went directly from India to Canada, and so they called it the Passage Act. And so as a result, there were efforts made. The interesting about the Japanese, the highest amount of immigration took place between 1903 and 1908. We had thousands of Japanese coming to Canada because there was a relationship between England and Japan, diplomatic relations in which Canada would not prevent Japanese from coming. So there weren't any legislation against Japanese coming as a result of that relationship. But finally in 1908, after this riot, the Canadian government did get Japan to agree to begin to limit the number of immigrants that we would come, and that was done mutually. And so it wasn't imposed upon Japan but it was mutually agreed upon to do that. And so then it meant that they restricted the number of males who could come. For females, and it didn't matter. It was unlimited. Numbers can come. It was only males that were limited to 400 per year. So as a result of not being able to vote, it also meant that they were unable to get into the professions. Because you can go to university, and many of our people went to University of BC, they graduated, they had degrees in medicine, they had degrees in engineering, teaching, and so on. But once they tried to get into those professions, they were denied. And it was denied on the basis that in order to be registered, say as a doctor, or as an architect or engineer, you had to be on the voters list. And because no Japanese was on that list, they could not enter the profession. So as a result, many of them turned to resource-based industries, such as berry farming, market gardening, especially near the Vancouver area, fishing, big industry for the Japanese. All along the coast of British Columbia, there were fishing canneries and fishing stations, and the majority of Japanese worked on those. Coal mining was the other one. This is in Cumberland, BC, and they had a huge coal mine there. An interesting place because in Cumberland they had a little town, and it was a Japanese section, a black section, a Chinese section in Cumberland. This is back in the early 1900s. One of the things that we tried to point out, that even people could not vote, there were a number of people who volunteered to fight in World War I. And this fellow Masumi Mitsui was the most decorated of all these soldiers. He won the Victoria Cross for his bravery. The interesting part about this is the fact that Japanese could not vote. But after they came back, the Japanese veterans wanted the right to vote. It took 14 years after the war ended before they finally received the right to vote. They were the only people in British Columbia of Japanese ancestry who could vote. And that has an effect later on when the Second World War starts, because many of the Japanese wanted to join the Canadian Army to fight in Europe, and they were refused. And the reason they were refused is that people were saying, if we let them in, we have to give them the right to vote. So they were refused on that basis. The Paul Street in Vancouver, it was the center of the Japanese community. And at the peak time, there would likely be about 20,000 Japanese who would have been living in the area. They had their businesses, a lot of rooming houses, because anyone who came from Japan would come to Vancouver before they shipped out to any other location in British Columbia. Businesses, schools, churches, all of these institutions during the Second World War were confiscated, taken, and closed. Cultural activities, you see the schools, and they maintained their culture through the center, but baseball was one of the big sports. And it's interesting because this team is called Asahi and became very famous. More recently, it was recognized in the Baseball Hall of Fame about 3 years ago. At a Blue Jay game about 3-4 years ago, they honored this team. There is a feature-length film that just came out last year it's called The Vancouver Asahi Story, made in Japan, but they came to Canada to do all the research. And there's a documentary on this team in the National Film Board. It's called Fighting Tigers. So this team had become very famous, and so it's something that we always sort of honor in our presentations. At the time that the war was beginning, and just prior to that, there was a lot of fears in British Columbia by politicians that the Japanese were taking over certain industries. The fishing industry was the big one. And also the market gardening, berry farming. My grandfather had a berry farm in Haney, BC. And they had a co-op, actually, their own cooperative that sold the berries to people. But they did very well. And so there was a lot of British Columbians trying to get the government to remove the Japanese. Similar to what we hear now about refugees or immigrants, about taking jobs and so on. Well, that existed at that time. And so here are some comments made by MPs at that time, during the time of the war when they were being elected. Let the slogan for British Columbia, no Japs from the Rockies to the seas. That's Alistair Mackenzie. Ian Mackenzie was the MP. Later in the cabinet of the Liberal government, he was the spokesperson in cabinet he was the expert on the Japanese problem in British Columbia. And after his statement, you can see why the internment kind of thing took place. Another person says they cannot be assimilated no matter how long the Japanese remain in Canada, they will always be Japanese. Fast forward to today, we're likely the most assimilated community in the country. The intermarriage rate in our community is 97%. It's very rare to see two Japanese people getting married, unless they're from Japan. That's about the only time. But within Canadian society, that's not the case. Just generally, I think the mixed marriages now run over 70% in our Japanese community. We only have 100,000 people, so when you figure it out, it's not people of whole Japanese are getting less and less, and that's because that's the trend with the census. I'd be interested where we are now with the next census. It was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, that really changed the lives of the Japanese in British Columbia. Up to that point, they had already worked into Canadian society. The majority of people were born in Canada by then. But this war will change their lives. The day after Pearl Harbor, all the fishing boats were confiscated. And you can just see how many boats there were. And in many cases, they had one of the faster boats because they built their own boats. And in fact, in the museum in Ottawa, they have one of those boats on display to show the kind of quality it was, even at that time. Many of those boats, by the way, were bought by the government after the confiscation, and when they were getting rid of the boats, they took the fastest boats, actually, the better ones. Things like cars, cameras, anything of security concern, radios, for example, they were all confiscated. And so you had to turn it in. People had these registration cards. They're called custodian. They are registered by the custodian of enemy properties, and they're called enemy alien cards. And you had to carry it. The interesting part about this is these cards were issued back in April before the war, before Pearl Harbor. And so there must have been some inclination that at some point this was going to happen. We don't have the actual documents to show that, but just by the actions, the interpretation could be that maybe there were things already being planned with regard to the Japanese in case it happened. It was under the War Measures Act that the removal orders were passed, and it meant that under the War Measures Act, it was Cabinet that could decide. In other words, Parliament was not involved in this process. It was Cabinet that had the full power to impose these orders. And so the order to remove people came from Cabinet. The order to sell their properties came from Cabinet. The order to set up internment camps came from Cabinet. And the Cabinet at that time consisted of about 8 people. And so they made the decision for the country. And the one person who was under Mackenzie, the one I told you about, was the person who decided the fate of the Japanese. Once the order was given in February to remove all Japanese, regardless of whether you were born in this country or not, they had to report to Hastings Park in Vancouver. These are people coming in from Vancouver Island because they were the first group of people to be moved. And they had to report to Hastings Park, which was originally animal stables for the Peony. And today, if you go there, the Peony Grounds, there is a plaque and information on the Hastings Park, the historical part of it. And this is a picture of Hastings Park. When they arrived here, the men were separated from their families, put into a different section. The women, children, and the elderly were placed in a different part of the facility. And you'll notice that in the left-hand picture, those are horse stalls. And the blankets just separate each horse stall for where each family lived. So that's what you were given, a horse stall for your family. And then this is a large sleeping area that was there for the men. Internment centers were being established in British Columbia because from Hastings Park, they were moved into internment centers. The one on the left is put up by the Canadian Army. They couldn't get it up fast enough, and the Hastings Park was getting filled. They had to move people out. So they had tents set up and moved people there. On the right, you see a picture of one of the, it could be Slocan, but those are buildings that were actually built by the government to house the people. And you can see they're all the same size. They're 14 by 28, about the size of this room, I think. And two families had to share it. And then here's a picture of inside of one. But when they went to internment center, the families were separated as well. So that became a real issue with some of the young people in our community, and they protested regarding the breakup of families, and they were all thrown in jail and eventually put into prisoner of war camps for protesting. Some were sent to sugar beet farms. At that time, shortage of laborers because of the war, and so they made arrangements to send Japanese people, instead of internment camps, they could go to a sugar beet farm. The picture on the left is in Alberta, the picture on the right is Manitoba, and I happen to be in that picture, working. I'm the guy with the hole on the right-hand side, and that's my younger brother, and there were one other child at that time. And that's the house that we stayed in Senegas, Manitoba. It was a 4-room house, and there were 3 families living in there. There's no water, no electricity. My grandfather had to build outdoor ofudo, which is a bath, and so on. Anyone who protested or were deemed to be a threat or were leaders, like leaders of churches, leaders of organizations, they all were sent to prisoner of war camps. Some 890 of them ended up in prisoner of war camps. And the reason for the big thing around their back is they had to wear these jackets with big circles so that they tried to escape, they would be easily identified and shot. And they were put into the same camps that the German Nazi prisoners that were captured as well. So they were deemed as, referred to as enemies, really. Within the camps, they continued many of the cultural activities. Schools were set up in some centers. The churches came in and set up schools, like the Roman Catholic Church and so on did in some of the larger centers. And others, young people within our community set up schools. Second World War, we had a number of vets or people who wanted to join the Army. I first told you that initially, when they applied, they were rejected. And they were told that the Canadian Army will not take Japanese. And again, as I told you, is because they would have to give them the right to vote. What happened, interesting enough, is Winston Churchill sent the British Army to Canada to recruit, or first of all, to arrange for interpreters, people of Japanese background who could speak Japanese, to help the British Army. And when Winston Churchill heard that Canada does not take Japanese in the Army, he got permission from the Canadian government to set up a British battalion in Canada of Japanese. That was approved. So all these people signed up, and they were signed up as British soldiers, as officers on top. Someone in Parliament got up and said, hold it, why is this happening? Why are we having our Canadian citizens being sent to another army? Because we won't take them. So they passed the legislation right away to accept Japanese into the army. So the day after that happened, all of these people who were officers then became privates in the Canadian Army. So a lot of them complained they had to take a pay cut as a result of Canada wanting them. This is the bombing of Hiroshima, ends the war. And the question then becomes for the government is, what do we do with all these people in internment camps, on sugar beet farms, etc.? What do we do with them? The government passes a repatriation bill. And if you think about the word repatriation, It basically means that you send someone back to the country of their origin, country where they were born. They passed this bill to send the Japanese to Japan. The intent was we would send them all to Japan, get rid of them. The problem was that the majority were Canadians, born in this country. So how do you send someone born in Canada to another country? And that struggle continued for about a year in Parliament. And finally it was rescinded after a lot of protests from other groups in Canada, civil liberty groups and other groups that said, if that could happen to a Japanese, could it happen to me? And that was the whole thing that they began to question the policy. And so Mackenzie King rescinded the bill, but by then some 4,000 people were already sent to Japan. Half of them were Canadian citizens. And the half that were Canadian citizens were young kids, because it was families going back, and these kids were too young to stay in Canada when the parents went back. So they had to go back with them. And what happened is when they went back to Japan, the situation was even worse there because the country was in shambles, and they were being discriminated because they weren't really Japanese, they were Canadian. A lot of them couldn't even speak Japanese, and they're being sent there. So it was a real problem for many of them. And then also, what to do with the rest of people, they finally gave people a choice. Either you go to Japan or you go east of the Rockies. In other words, you could not go back to the West Coast, but you could go east of the Rockies. Many went to Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, wherever. And this is what we call the dispersal policy, because it basically broke up our community, sent people all over the place. And as a result, if you look at our country today, you'll never find a Japan part of any community in the country. Like you could go to Montreal, you'll not find a Japanese town like Chinatown, for example. You go to the United States, where the policy was a little different, they have maintained Japan towns in Chicago, New York, San Francisco, anywhere, because their policy was they were only kept away for possibly 6 months or a little longer, whereas in Canada, we were kept away from the West Coast for 9 years, 42 to 49, 7 years. In 1948, the Japanese received the franchise, the right to vote. I have a certificate of my father. He became a Canadian citizen December 3rd in 1948, and he had never left Canada. He was born here, and yet he had to apply to become a citizen. In 49, April 1st, the last restrictive bill was rescinded, and that bill allowed the Japanese finally to return to the West Coast, where all their properties were by that time gone, and they really had nothing to return to, but you could go back if you wanted. And many did, many did. Our population in Canada today is split between East and West, about the same number in Ontario, Quebec, as there are in British Columbia. And then there's a certain number in the middle.